The arrangement had no name because naming it would have required acknowledging it, and acknowledging it would have required the department to confront, officially and on the record, the specific nature of what it was doing and what it depended on and what that dependence said about the adequacy of its authorized methods. So it had no name. It had, instead, a set of practices that had accumulated over 2 decades into something so embedded in the department's operational reality that the people who maintained those practices had, in many cases, stopped thinking of them as practices at all and had begun experiencing them simply as how things were. The particular institutional texture of working in a department where one officer's methods generated a consistent volume of formal complaints and a consistent volume of closed cases, and where the relationship between those two consistent volumes had never been officially examined and was never going to be, because examining it would have required naming the arrangement, and the arrangement had no name. Harry Callahan, for his part, had understood the arrangement from very early in his career, had understood it with the same clear-eyed pragmatism that organized his understanding of every other institutional dynamic he operated within, and had made a decision that he revisited occasionally over 26 years but never fundamentally revised. The arrangement was the price of doing the work, and the work was worth the arrangement's price, and the specific form that the price took. The perpetual institutional use without institutional acknowledgement, the department's permanent comfort in receiving what Harry produced while maintaining perpetual discomfort with how he produced it, was simply the shape of the transaction, and the shape was not going to change, and Harry had organized his professional life around working within a shape he had not chosen and could not change rather than expending energy on the futile project of trying to alter it. The arrangement worked as follows, though the word work deserves qualification, because the arrangement worked in the way that most institutional arrangements that depend on not naming themselves work, imperfectly, at significant ongoing cost, and primarily in the direction of the institution's interests rather than the individual's. The department needed what Harry produced. This need was genuine and substantial and had, over 20 years, become structural. Not in the sense that the department would have immediately ceased to function without Harry's specific contribution, but in the sense that the department's record of outcomes in certain categories of case had been shaped, over 2 decades, by what Harry contributed to those categories, and that the record would have looked meaningfully different without that contribution. Cases that would have gone cold had been closed. Threats that would have escalated had been neutralized. The specific gap between law and justice that existed in San Francisco, the gap that had organized Harry's entire career, had been walked into and partially filled, year after year, by a detective whose methods for filling it the department could not officially sanction and whose outcomes from filling it the department had consistently benefited from. This was the use. The department used Harry Callahan for 20 years to produce outcomes it could not officially produce through its authorized methods, and it received those outcomes while maintaining, in every official context, the position that Harry's methods were problematic and that the department was managing rather than endorsing them. The management was the use. The endorsement that never happened was the acknowledgement that never happened. And the two of them together, the management and the absence of acknowledgement, constituted the arrangement that had no name. Captain Donnelly had been the most direct institutional expression of the arrangement over the bulk of Harry's career, the person whose specific job it was to perform the management that allowed the use to continue without becoming the acknowledgement that would have changed its nature. Donnelly had been good at this job in the way that certain institutional operators are good at a specific kind of complex systemic maintenance, not through brilliance or exceptional vision but through a patient, granular understanding of exactly how much pressure each part of the system could absorb before something snapped, and a consistent skill at distributing that pressure so that nothing ever snapped in any way that couldn't be managed. He had managed internal affairs reviews that, handled differently, could have generated consequences that ended Harry's career. He had managed the formal complaints from defense attorneys that accumulated with the specific regularity of a system doing exactly what it was designed to do, which was to document Harry's methods without ever documenting the context that made those methods comprehensible. He had managed the relationships with the city attorney's office and the mayor's office and the civil rights organizations whose concerns about Harry's record were legitimate and whose concerns about Harry's record were based on the same 30% of the relevant picture that every official view of Harry's career was based on. In managing all of these relationships, Donnelly had been performing a service not just for the department but for the city. Maintaining, at significant ongoing personal and institutional cost, an arrangement that produced public safety outcomes that no officially sanctioned process was producing and that nobody in any position of official authority was willing to acknowledge producing, because acknowledging the source of the outcomes would have required either defending methods that couldn't be officially defended or abandoning outcomes that couldn't be officially abandoned. This maintenance had cost Donnelly something too, in a way that was less visible than what the arrangement had cost Harry's partners and less dramatic than what it had cost Eddie Morrison, but real and cumulative in its own right. Donnelly had spent 20 years in proximity to a knowledge he could never officially express. The knowledge that the department's authorized methods were insufficient to the city's actual safety needs, that the gap between what the department could officially do and what the city actually required was not a temporary problem being actively addressed but a structural feature of the institution that nobody in a position to address it had any interest in addressing, because addressing it would have required either expanding the authorized methods in ways that the civil rights framework correctly constrained, or honestly acknowledging the gap and the unofficial arrangement that filled it, which was the kind of honesty that institutions with legal exposure were constitutionally incapable of. Donnelly had lived inside this knowledge for 20 years, managing its consequences without being able to address its cause, and the management had left him with the specific fatigue of a man who has spent 2 decades being more honest in private than he has been allowed to be in any official context, whose professional life has consisted of maintaining a fiction that he understood was a fiction and that he had never found a way to stop maintaining because stopping would have required either ending the arrangement or naming it, and both options had consequences that he had never found acceptable. The people above Donnelly in the chain, the chiefs and deputy chiefs and city officials who set the institutional tone within which Donnelly operated, had their own relationship with the arrangement, and it was the most comfortable relationship of all, because it was the most distant one. They received the outcomes. They were insulated from the specifics of how the outcomes were produced. The information that reached them about Harry Callahan had been processed through Donnelly and through the official channels that Donnelly navigated, which meant it arrived in a form that had already been managed, already shaped to emphasize the liability concerns and minimize the operational dependency, already framed in the language of a problematic officer being managed rather than an essential asset being used. This framing served everyone above Donnelly in the chain, because it allowed them to maintain, in complete good faith, the institutional position that they were managing a problem rather than depending on a solution, that the department's relationship with Harry Callahan was one of reluctant tolerance rather than structural need. This good faith was real, in the sense that the people at the top of the chain genuinely believed the framing they had been given. The framing was also, in the deep and structural sense, false, but the falseness had been processed out of what reached them, through the patient and exhausting management work that Donnelly had been doing for 20 years, and so the falseness never reached them, and they maintained their institutional positions in good faith, and the arrangement continued, and nobody at the top ever had to acknowledge anything because nothing ever reached the top in a form that required acknowledgement. Below Donnelly, among the officers who had worked in the same division as Harry over the years, the relationship with the arrangement took a different form, not comfortable like the top, not exhausting like Donnelly, but something stranger and more varied. The officers who had worked closely alongside Harry, who had been on scenes with him and worked cases parallel to his and watched what he did from the specific vantage point of colleagues operating in the same professional space, these officers had the most accurate picture of what Harry produced and how he produced it. They also had the least official space to express that picture, because expressing it would have required either endorsing methods that the official culture required them not to endorse or criticizing outcomes that their own professional survival instincts understood were connected to the safety of the streets they also worked on. So most of them said very little about Harry in any official context, maintaining a professional neutrality that served the same purpose as Donnelly's management. It allowed the arrangement to continue without being named, but that came from a different direction, from the street-level understanding that what Harry did was real and that the official position on what Harry did was incomplete, and that the gap between those two things was not something that any individual officer, watching Harry work and understanding what they were watching, was in any position to publicly reconcile. The unofficial acknowledgement existed among them in abundance. The official acknowledgement remained absent, as it always had been, as it always would be, as long as the arrangement had no name. The civil rights organizations that had documented Harry's record over the years, the organizations whose concerns the Marsh article had drawn on, whose formal complaints had contributed to the 400 pages of internal affairs file. These organizations were, paradoxically, the closest thing to an honest official account of the arrangement that existed in the public record. Not because their account was accurate, their account was the same 30% picture that every official account was, accurate in what it contained and systematically missing what it didn't contain. But because their account was the only official account that had been motivated by something other than the arrangement's self-interest. The department's official account was motivated by the arrangement's maintenance. The city's official account was motivated by the arrangement's political management. The civil rights organization's account was motivated by genuine concern for a genuine problem, the genuine problem of police conduct that exceeded authorized parameters without adequate accountability. And their account, while incomplete, was at least honestly incomplete in the sense of being genuinely limited by what was available rather than deliberately shaped to conceal what was inconvenient. The irony was that the most honest incomplete account of Harry Callahan in the public record was the account that most misrepresented what Harry Callahan actually was, because it was the account with the least access to the information that would have complicated its portrait. The arrangement's most consistent achievement, across 20 years of operation, was the production of this irony at scale. The most honest external account was the least accurate one, and the most accurate internal accounts were the least honest ones, and between these two poles the arrangement lived and breathed and produced its outcomes and paid its costs and was never, at any point in 20 years, officially named or officially acknowledged by any entity with the institutional standing to make that naming or acknowledgement meaningful. Harry had understood the arrangement's logic completely enough to have made, early in his career, a deliberate decision about his own relationship to it. He had decided that he was not going to spend his professional life seeking acknowledgement that the arrangement structure made impossible, that the energy required to pursue acknowledgement through channels that had been organized to prevent it was energy that could be spent on the work, and that the work was the reason he was there and that the work's outcomes were what mattered and that the acknowledgement was, in the accounting Harry applied to most things, not the primary variable. This decision was not made easily or in a single moment, it had assembled itself over the first several years of Harry's career, through a series of experiences with official channels that taught him, incrementally and then cumulatively, exactly what the official channels could and could not process, what they would and would not reflect back to him, what he could expect from them and what he could not. By the time the arrangement had become fully visible to Harry as an arrangement rather than a series of individual institutional responses, he had already largely made his peace with it, not because the arrangement was just, which it wasn't, but because his alternatives to it were worse. He could leave. He could stay and fight the arrangement instead of working within it. He could stay and work within it while seeking periodic acknowledgement that he had no reason to expect and consistently did not receive. Or he could stay and work within it without seeking acknowledgement, doing the work because the work needed doing and the doing of it was its own sufficient reason. He had chosen the fourth option. He had been choosing it every day for 20 years. And the choosing had produced, as the only realistic available outcome of the fourth option, exactly the arrangement that had no name and that the department maintained and depended on and never once acknowledged. They used him, and he let them use him, because the alternative to being used was the city not receiving what the city needed, and Harry had decided, somewhere in the first years of his career, that the city receiving what it needed was more important than Harry receiving what he was owed. This decision, the fundamental decision that organized Harry's entire professional life and that made the arrangement possible and that the arrangement depended on, was a decision of extraordinary character, and it is worth sitting with that characterization for a moment, because the word character is easy to use and easy to sentimentalize and easy to strip of its actual content by using it too quickly. Harry's decision to do the work without the acknowledgement was not a simple or costless virtue. It was a decision that had required, to become stable, the elimination of the expectation of acknowledgement. Not the suppression of the expectation, which would have required ongoing effort and would have generated the specific strain of sustained suppression, but the actual elimination of the expectation at the level of basic professional orientation. Harry had stopped expecting the department to acknowledge what had used him for, not because he had resigned himself to disappointment but because he had genuinely restructured his relationship with the work in a way that made the acknowledgement irrelevant to his motivation for doing it. The work was the motivation. The outcomes were the validation. The city's continued functioning, imperfect, ungrateful, structurally dependent on a contribution it could never officially recognize, was the evidence that the work had been worth doing. This structure required, in turn, a specific quality of self-sufficiency that was not the same as self-sufficiency in the ordinary sense of simple independence. It was the self-sufficiency of someone who had found a way to validate the most important things they did through the outcomes those things produced rather than through any social or institutional transaction, who had located their professional identity in the work itself rather than in any external recognition of the work. It was, in its own way, an extraordinary quality, and it had been built, not given, through 20 years of exactly the kind of daily practice that an arrangement with no name and no acknowledgement required of the person at its center. The 26 years ended, as they had always been going to end, with paperwork signed in a desk drawer and a drive north and a city that didn't wave. The arrangement ended when the paperwork was signed, because the arrangement required Harry's operational presence to continue and the retirement terminated that presence. The department's dependency on what Harry had provided did not end. The structural gap that he had spent 26 years walking into persisted after him, was distributed across other officers who filled it imperfectly in the ways that ordinary capability fills gaps that exceptional capability had previously occupied, but the specific version of the arrangement that had organized Harry's career, the specific form of use without acknowledgement that had been his professional reality for 2 decades, ended the morning he drove north. The department processed his retirement through standard administrative channels, generating the standard documentation and the standard acknowledgments of tenure and service that the department generated for all retiring officers. These standard acknowledgments contained nothing specific to what Harry's 26 years had actually consisted of. They were accurate in the way that official documents were accurate when applied to careers that the official documentation framework could not fully contain, accurate in what they noted and silent about what they couldn't note, which was everything that mattered. Harry received his retirement paperwork in the mail approximately 3 weeks after driving north. He read it once and filed it with the same flat absence of ceremony he had brought to every other piece of official paperwork over 26 years, and that was the official record's final word on the arrangement that had organized his career, and the official record's final word was, as the official record's word on Harry Callahan had always been, incomplete in the specific way that matters most, which is the way that leaves out the thing that the document is ostensibly about and contains. Only the things that the system producing the document is capable of recognizing, which had never been the things that were actually true about Harry Callahan and was not going to start being those things now, at the end. In the paperwork of a retirement that the city received as the departure of a problematic officer finally concluded rather than as the loss of something that had been holding parts of the city together that nobody had ever officially noticed were being held. The specific version of this incompleteness that the retirement paperwork represented was, in some ways, the most honest thing the official record had ever produced about Harry Callahan, because it was incompleteness without pretense. A document that did not claim to capture what it was leaving out, that simply processed a retirement through standard channels and produced a standard document, without any of the defensive framing or the liability management that had characterized the official record during Harry's active career. The active career had generated documents that were incomplete in a motivated way. The internal affairs reviews that were incomplete because they were oriented toward managing liability rather than understanding the career, the formal reprimands that were incomplete because they documented violations without documenting the context that made the violations comprehensible. The retirement paperwork was incomplete in a simpler and in some ways more honest way. It was simply the standard output of a system that processed retirements in a standard way, and Harry's retirement did not fit the standard template in any of the ways that would have made the standard output accurate, and the system had no mechanism for accommodating that misfit and had therefore simply produced the standard output anyway. There was a kind of institutional honesty in this. The honesty of a system that had reached its limit and was not pretending otherwise, that had simply produced what it was capable of producing and had left the rest to whatever accounting existed outside its structure. The rest, which was everything that mattered, lived where it had always lived. In Harry's private accounting, in the 43 pages and the Calder map, in the specific knowledge of 11 partners and what each of them had paid, in the woman on Clement Street putting out her coffee without knowing why it felt right, in the warehouse that had not burned, in the specific and irreducible territory of outcomes that the official record had never contained and was never going to contain. What the arrangement had cost the city. Not Harry, not the partners, not Donnelly, but the city itself, is worth examining as a final accounting, because the city paid too, even though the city's payment was the least visible of all. The city had received, for 20 years, the specific benefits of Harry Callahan's work without ever developing the institutional knowledge of where those benefits came from or what was required to produce them. This meant that when Harry retired, the city did not understand what it was losing, could not plan for the loss, could not identify what structural changes might be required to compensate for the absence of something it had never officially acknowledged having. The city had been relying on Harry as an off-budget, undocumented, officially denied operational capacity, and when that capacity was removed the city's official planning had no mechanism for accounting for its removal, because the official planning had no mechanism for accounting for its existence. The gap that Harry had walked into for 20 years, the gap between law and justice, between official capacity and actual need. That gap persisted and would continue to persist, but it would now be filled differently, by different people with different capabilities and different tolerances for the specific kind of cost that walking into it consistently produced, and the filling would be less complete and the outcomes would be less reliable and the city would absorb this diminishment without understanding what had produced it, because understanding what had produced it required understanding the arrangement that had been filling the gap, and the arrangement had no name, and the nameless thing had retired, and the city processed the retirement through standard administrative channels and moved on to the next item on the agenda. Donnelly had retired 3 years before Harry, as has been noted, and had spent those 3 years living in the specific and somewhat restless freedom of a man who has spent 2 decades maintaining a complex institutional arrangement and who finds, in its absence, that he does not entirely know what to do with the energy the maintenance had required. He gardened. He read histories of municipal governance, which might have struck outside observers as a strange leisure choice for a man who had spent 26 years embedded in exactly that subject, but which made a specific kind of sense for someone who understood municipal governance from the inside and was now trying to place that understanding in a larger context. He thought about Harry occasionally, with the specific private quality of someone thinking about a former professional relationship that had never been fully articulated even between the two parties to it, that had operated in the register of shared understanding rather than explicit communication, and whose conclusion, Harry's retirement, the end of the arrangement, had never generated any conversation between them, because a conversation about the end of the arrangement would have required naming the arrangement, and the arrangement had no name, and both of them had known this for long enough that the inability to name it had become simply one more feature of the thing itself. He would have liked, Donnelly thought occasionally in the garden, to have said something to Harry that the arrangement had never allowed him to say. Not an apology, because the arrangement had not been wrong in any simple sense, and not a thank you, because a thank you implied a transaction that had been honestly conducted between parties with equal understanding of its terms, and the terms had been deliberately unequal in a way that a retrospective thank you could not retroactively balance. Something else, something that the available language did not have a clean form for, something like, "I understood what you were doing and I protected you as well as I was able to within the constraints of what I was allowed to protect, and the constraints were unjust, and I was complicit in the injustice in the specific way that institutional operators are complicit in the injustices of the systems they maintain, and I am not asking for absolution for that complicity, I am simply noting, here in private, that I knew what it was and I did it anyway because the alternative seemed worse, which may not have been true and which I will not know for certain, and which was the best accounting I could produce of a situation that the accounting systems available to me were not designed to fully capture." This was not a thing that Donnelly had ever said to Harry, and was not a thing he would say, and was perhaps not a thing that needed to be said because Harry, who had understood the arrangement from the beginning, had also understood everything that Donnelly would have said about it, and the understanding between them had been real and functional and had never required articulation to be what it was. The city drove on. The department absorbed the retirement through its standard processes. The streets continued being the streets. And somewhere north of San Francisco, in the direction that fog and morning and a Tuesday in March had pointed, a man drove with a Calder file in the back seat and 11 partners in his private accounting and a city's worth of unnamed use behind him and the specific knowledge, permanent and carried in his alone, of what 20 years of an arrangement that had no name had actually contained. Not what it had cost him, which was real and had been paid, not what it had produced, which was real and would persist in the specific and undocumented way that protected lives persist in the texture of ordinary days that continue, not what it had taken from the people around him, which was real and was theirs to carry in their own ways. What he carried was simpler and more total than any of those specific accountings. The knowledge that the thing had been done, that it had mattered, that the mattering was real regardless of whether it was visible, and that visibility had never been the point and was not going to be the point now, at the end, driving north into whatever came after the arrangement. After the use, after the no acknowledgement, after the 20 years of being essential to a city that had organized its entire relationship with him around the comfortable fiction that it was managing a problem rather than depending on a solution. The solution had driven away. The comfortable fiction remained. The city would maintain it indefinitely, as comfortable fictions are maintained, with the particular ease of things that have never had to confront their own falseness because the thing that would have forced the confrontation has gone north, and the fog has closed behind it, and the city continues, as cities do, without understanding what it was that just left. There is a class of institutional arrangements that are so embedded in the operational reality of the institutions that contain them that they survive the departure of the specific individuals who made them work, not through any deliberate succession planning but through the simple persistence of the structural needs that produced them in the first place. Harry's arrangement was not of this class. It did not survive his departure because it had been built around a specific and unreplicable combination of capability and willingness that had taken 26 years to accumulate and that could not be transferred or replicated through any institutional process the department possessed. The structural need persisted. The arrangement did not. And the gap between the persistent need and the departed capacity became, in the years after Harry's retirement, a slowly growing divergence between the department's outcomes in certain categories of case and the baseline that Harry's career had established for those outcomes. A divergence that was real and measurable by anyone who knew to look for it, and that nobody in the department's official structure had been prepared to look for because nobody in the department's official structure had officially acknowledged the relationship between Harry's presence and the baseline they were now falling below. The divergence was attributed, in the various informal analyses that senior officers conducted without putting them in writing, to any number of factors that were real and contributory: staffing changes, budget constraints, demographic shifts in the city's crime patterns, the retirement of other experienced officers alongside Harry. Nobody attributed it to the absence of Harry Callahan specifically, because attributing it to Harry's absence would have required acknowledging that Harry's presence had been producing something that his absence was no longer producing, which would have required acknowledging the arrangement, which had no name, which was not going to acquire one in his absence any more than it had had one in his presence. The divergence grew quietly, absorbed into the operational baseline without official comment, taken as given rather than as consequence, the city continuing in its comfortable and permanent and completely accurate ignorance of what the arrangement that had no name had actually been doing to keep certain things from diverging that were now diverging, slowly, without anyone responsible for them understanding why. The honest account of the arrangement. The account that would have named it, described its logic, traced its costs and its benefits and its dependency and its duration. That account lived in the gap between what the official record contained and what the people who had been inside the arrangement actually knew. Harry knew it most completely. Donnelly knew it nearly as completely. Bressler had known a version of it before his own retirement. The officers who had worked alongside Harry knew fragments of it with varying degrees of accuracy. The civil rights organizations had an accurate account of its costs and no account of its benefits. The department's official record had a partial account of its costs and no account of its benefits. The city's political apparatus had no account of either, having received only the already managed version that Donnelly's operation had produced. And the city at large. The people on the streets, in the apartments, on the buses, in the stores, had no account of any of it, had never been told that an arrangement existed, had simply experienced, across 20 years, the specific difference that the arrangement's outcomes had made to the texture of their ordinary lives, without any mechanism for connecting that difference to its source, which was a man driving north in March fog with a file in the back seat and 20 years of unnamed use behind him and the complete and private and permanently sufficient knowledge of what it had all actually been. The arrangement had no name. It had produced real things. The real things persisted in the lives they had affected and in the knowledge of the man who had made them and in nothing that the official record of a 26-year career in the San Francisco Police Department would ever contain. This was the arrangement. This was what it had been. And it was over now, and the city had not noticed, and Harry drove north, and the fog continued, and the real things persisted in their specific and ordinary and entirely unnamed way, as real things do when they have been produced by something the world was not organized to acknowledge and was not going to start acknowledging now. What made the arrangement survivable for Harry across 20 years was not resilience in the ordinary sense. Not the resilience of someone who absorbs ongoing difficulty and keeps going through sheer determination. It was something more specific, the specific form of sufficiency he had built into his relationship with the work itself, the way he had restructured his professional identity so that the work's outcomes were their own complete validation and the institutional acknowledgement, while owed, was not required. This form of sufficiency was not natural to most people and was not something Harry had arrived at easily. It had been built, over the first years of his career, through a process of gradual divestment from the expectation of institutional reciprocity that had required him to fundamentally revise what he believed he was owed and by whom. He had believed, early in his career, that good work produced official recognition in proportion to its quality, that the institutional transaction was honest in the basic sense of reflecting back to the person doing the work an accurate account of its value. He had been educated out of this belief by the simple experience of doing excellent work and watching the institutional transaction reflect back not its value but its procedural cost, not its outcomes but its methods, not what it had produced but what it had violated. The education had been thorough and not particularly gentle, and it had ended with Harry understanding, with complete clarity, that the institutional transaction was not and was never going to be honest in the way he had originally understood, and that his choices were to find a different source of professional validation or to spend 20 years angry about the dishonesty of a transaction he could not change. He had found the different source. The work had become it. And the arrangement had lived on that foundation for 2 decades, on Harry's structurally independent motivation, on his genuinely complete validation through outcomes rather than recognition, on the specific form of professional integrity that requires nothing from the institution to sustain itself and therefore cannot be compromised by the institution's failure to offer what it owes. They had used him for 20 years and never admitted it. He had let them use him for 20 years and never needed the admission. The arrangement had lived in exactly that gap, between what was owed and what was required, between what the institution had failed to offer and what Harry had genuinely stopped needing it to offer. The gap was real. The arrangement lived in it. And when Harry drove north it closed behind him, not with any formal conclusion but simply with the departure of the specific conditions that had made it what it was, leaving the institution with its standard documentation of a retirement and the city with its standard continuation of itself and Harry with everything else, which was the only accounting that was ever going to be complete.